Hello everyone, welcome to this series exploring the literature of First Enoch. In this series, we want to unpack the tradition that we call First Enoch. We want to understand its historical context, and we also want to understand its literary context and how the ideas that are central to its theology came about in the Second Temple period of Judaism. To begin with, I want to start this series by talking about the origins of the literature, what groups within Second Temple Judaism it was associated with, and how this informs our understanding of its literary development. We begin by noting that Enochic literature itself is identified by scholars as belonging to a distinct group of Judaism which was prevalent in the post-exilic age. James C. Vanderkam notes that it's widely agreed that First Enoch and Jubilees belong to a single stream of tradition in Second Temple Judaism. And what he means there by a single stream of tradition is that this stream of tradition was separate from groups that we commonly understand as, say, the Pharisees, the Zadokites, the Essenes, etc. David R. Jackson clarifies this more and says this literature represents one important tradition for a portion of the Jewish community, which accepted it as authoritative. And this is really what defines Enochic literature itself and the group that was associated with it, which has been dubbed by scholars as Enochic Judaism, mainly because for them, the literature that was associated with the Patriarch of Enoch was viewed as authoritative, which, as far as other Second Temple Jewish groups are concerned, wasn't a common view in the era. Understanding the Enochic Jewish origins of this literature, we can then ask the question as to what actually separated its theology, what made it a distinct group in Second Temple Judaism. And Boccaccini outlines this. He says the catalyst of Enochic Judaism was its unique concept of the origin of evil. And this unique concept of the origin of evil was connected with the fall of the angels, which the Enochic groups understood as being ultimately responsible for the spread of evil and impurity on the earth in the pre-flood era. He continues to say that for the author of First Enoch, the cosmic order, that is, the created good order of God, was broken by the trespass of angels who descended to earth to teach humanity. And this is an event that was separate from the fall of humanity in the garden, yet was intrinsically connected with it on a fundamental level, meaning that the fall of humanity in the garden was what brought about death in the world, but this fall of the angels outside of the garden and their mixing with humanity is what really spread wickedness and sin in the pre-flood era. He says that while the biblical traditions only vaguely retain this story, and there he's referring to Genesis 6, 1-4, and I've just completed 2 videos talking about that. If you would like to know more, you can click on the card above, which will take you to those videos. But here he says that while the biblical traditions only vaguely retain this story, he says that in the Enochic corpus, this narrative was developed in First Enoch according to a trajectory which really centered it as the main paradigm for the origin of evil. And that's something that we don't see within the biblical text itself. And so from that alone, we can see that the Enochic text and then the Enochic Jewish community that was birthed out of this literature really does have a unique place among the Second Temple Jewish communities in that their understanding of the origin of sin was very different from a lot of their other Jewish brothers and their own theologies of sin and evil. I want to delve a little bit further into this idea of sin and evil, and to do so, I want to look at David R. Jackson and his 3 paradigms that constitute Enochic theology. For Jackson, he identifies 3 key narrative elements, and these are the illicit unions between angels and women. And this is the narrative that we find within the Genesis 1-11 of the Bible. This is really the only thing that's emphasized here, is this a union between heaven and earth, the sons of God and the daughters of men producing Nephilim. And we see that this is really taken in the Enochic literature a little bit further to talk about the illicit unions that mixed heaven and earth and broke the good boundaries that God had initially created. And you can find that in 1 Enoch 7, 15, and 16 as well. The second main narrative element that helps us to understand the Enochic concept of evil is this idea not just of the union between the angels and the women, but also the teaching that the angels taught their wives. And this Jackson identifies as the improper revelation of the angels. And this is something that we do see within the primeval narrative of Genesis, but it's a little bit different. It's not actually a focus on angels, it's more the descendants of Cain who are the bringers of culture. And the elements of culture are, while they're neutral in the text, you can deduce from the context, especially with how people use their culture and the inventions they bring, that it is also the means for humanity to spread wickedness on the earth. In the Enochic literature, however, it's the angels who introduce this technology, and the result of that is the spread of wickedness through the world. And the third thing that really is a byproduct of both of these first two paradigms is the breakdown of cosmic order in relation to the ordering of the cosmos, the ordering of the heavenly hosts, as an effect of the boundary breaking of the angels. Now, I'll explore those a little bit deeper in this next section just to flesh out what we mean by these. So, firstly, with regard to the illicit unions, the angels' sin is predominantly a corruption of humanity, which is originally good and turning it towards the inclination of evil. And that's sort of epitomized in the offspring of the marriage between the heavenly and the earthly. And this is in the giants, the offspring of these unions, who are giants, which spread further iniquity upon the earth. They consume everything in front of them, they eat all things, they kill everything, and they spread bloodshed upon the earth. The reason this is so bad within the Enochic understanding is that the angels were not initially created to have wives because they are immortal beings. And first Enoch 15:3-6 really expresses this, is that procreation is a distinctively human feature. And according to the Enochic worldview, humanity who are mortal and are determined to die need to procreate in order for their species to continue, whereas the angels who are immortal do not need to procreate because they don't die, and so there's no need for them to propagate further of their kind. But for humanity, marriage and childbearing is a God-given means for them to endure upon the earth, for them to, like we read in Genesis 1:26-28, to be fruitful and multiply. The consequence of this is not only the impurity of humanity, so not only now is the human seed itself corrupted through this intermingling of heavenly and earthly, but the further detail which is fleshed out later in First Enoch and also in other Enochic texts like the Book of Jubilees, is that the prevalence of evil spirits who inflict humanity are related to the giants. When the giants are wiped out in the flood, their spirits remain to inflict humanity, and this causes all manner of illness, disease, and wickedness on the earth. So that's really the Enochic understanding of the illicit unions and how that affects the created order. Next, we see that the teaching of the angels is what enables humanity to spread more wickedness on the earth. And Genesis 6:5 says that God looked and saw that all of the thoughts of mankind were only evil all the time. And this is the Enochic response to that. It's because the angels had taught humanity to sin in things that they had taught them. And James Kugel, in his Traditions of the Bible, sort of helps to flesh this out by noting that each of the skills revealed by the angels can be sorted into three groups, which are actually sort of the three main groups of sins when we look at the Torah itself. He says, in these passages, the knowledge passed on to human beings was of the sort that might lead directly to sin. Firstly, the making of swords and daggers and shields and breastplates would allow the humans to commit murder and robbery. He says also the ability to make bracelets and ornaments and the art of making up the eyes and of beautifying the eyelids would obviously lead to sexual promiscuity and all of the ills that follow that. And then finally, while a knowledge of the most precious and choice stones is connected to the fashioning of statues and hence the worship of idols. So here we have the three main issues of human sin in the world. We have violence and murder and wickedness, we have sexual immorality, and we also have idolatry as the um, three main manifestations of human sin in the broken created order. And so the author of First Enoch then will declare that it's the watchers and their teaching that creates sin on the world, and therefore it's all sin is to be subscribed to them. As well as this, the third thing is the idea of the collapse of cosmic order. And this really comes from the understanding in the Enochic and indeed actually the broader Second Temple context of understanding angels as being the regents or commanders of cosmic phenomena. And first Enoch 15:3 uses language that's highly suggestive of a liturgical role given to the angels in their stewardship of the cosmic order. And we see this also especially in the later sections of the astronomical book in First Enoch, where the heavenly phenomena are constantly referred to as being led by the angels, and the angels themselves are called the watchers or those who keep watch over the heavenly phenomena. And so it's no surprise that due to the transgression of the watchers, the one who are meant to watch over the heavenly phenomenon over humanity, in them abandoning that the cosmic order is then led astray in like to their sin. And this then results in the whole entire cosmic order being broken down into sin on all of its fundamental levels. This is in the Enochic understanding why God has to send the flood to cleanse the world, and then he also must chain the angels. The chaining of the angels is to stop the source of wickedness, and then the flood is to cleanse the earth of their wickedness. And we can see this even in the New Testament in books like Jude and 2 Peter. But while the biblical authors will say that the flood fixed the problem and that the world was cleansed, the Enochic understanding will say that, well, no, sin still prevails, and actually, while the world was cleansed and the created order was cleansed, it was not purified and returned to its initial good state. And I would actually argue that we see this too in the biblical account. We see that when Noah gets off the ark, when he gets off the ark after the flood, there is this story of him falling immediately into sin. And then, of course, when we read the rest of the Torah and the rest of the Bible, human sin is a constant stumbling block in God's plan of salvation. And so I think the Enochic understanding of the flood cleansing but not purifying is also a very clear biblical one. On top of this, the chaining of the angels, while it's meant to stop the continued influence of the demonic realm on the world, it doesn't actually deal with the spiritual evil that is continually spread through the spirits of the giants. While the giants are wiped out in the flood, their spirits remain and they continue to lead humanity astray and continue to spread wickedness. So while the angels are chained, their influence is still felt in the world. And this is why in the Enochic understanding there is the need of the eschatological fire of the great day of judgment, which will bring forth a new creation. So now that we've outlined the theology and the Jewish origins of Enochic Judaism and indeed Enochic literature, I think the next step in our study will be understanding the history of the Enochic tradition itself, where this literature comes from, and how we can kind of piece together some of the literary history of the manuscripts that we have. I want to begin by looking at Helge Kvanvig's Primeval History, where he outlines the influence of the Enochic corpus. He says the writings of the Enochic corpus have a long history in Judaism and Christianity. The Enochic writings enjoyed great popularity in the community situated at Qumran. They were copied and quoted in much the same manner of those books that now belong to the Hebrew Bible. He then continues, even in the New Testament, Enoch is explicitly quoted as a prophet in Jude 1:14 and alluded to in Jude 1:6 and 2 Peter 2:4-5. In all these cases, the references are to the Book of Watchers, which we'll talk about as actually being the oldest section of the Enochic literature. He then jumps forward again and says even in early Christianity, the authority of the Enochic scriptures was defended by influential theologians, and by that he means the church fathers, such as Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Origen, although they knew that this authority was not recognized in all the churches. He says the authority of Enoch was then strongly denounced by Augustine and the City of God, which most possibly why the reason this book went out of use and was forgotten in the Western Church. But he does state that it survives in the Orthodox Ethiopian Church, and this church is, through the centuries, has been isolated from the rest of the churches, and this is why this literature is still read in this tradition. So what he's sketching here is just a brief understanding of its influence and why this literature is still around, and what it's accomplished in its literary history. And we see that while it was influential in ancient Judaism, it was also influential in the New Testament and also in the early history of the church. Margaret Barker sums it in a little bit of a shorter way. She says, the Book of Enoch has long been recognized as the most important Jewish writing before the New Testament period. It shed light on the beliefs and teachings of the early church. Although it was known and used by them, it was not written by them, but was part of their Jewish heritage. And this is getting at the idea in most scholarship dealing with Enochic Judaism, that Christianity is actually deeply connected to the Enochic movements that we see even later into Qumran, and that the ideas in the Enochic literature are ones that are carried forward into early Christian literature itself. Moving even further back than the influence of this literature on Christianity, we actually find that most scholars will suggest an even older date for a lot of this Jewish literature and actually connect it to even older traditions before the Bible. It's highly speculative, but some scholars have suggested that the Enochic corpus actually appeals to a body of antediluvian teaching, that is, pre-flood teaching, that predates even the revelation of Moses. And Neil Forsyth sort of hints at this when he says that the oldest texts we now have of the Enochic literature are Aramaic fragments, the earliest of which date to the first part of the 2nd century BC. This makes them contemporary with the exilic sections of the Bible. But he says that one part of this literature, the Book of Watches, which comprises the first 36 chapters of the Book of Enoch, actually incorporates even older material. He says that this part, the Visions of Enoch, contains stuff that can go back even to the 3rd century BC. On top of that, he says that there are actually sections of the book that seem to quote from a now lost text called the Hebrew Book of Noah. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the coming sections. But he also continues and says that the astronomical book of Enoch, which is preserved in the Qumran fragments, goes back to even the origins of Mesopotamian astronomy, which puts it back in before even Genesis was written. So he concludes that the Enochic tradition then is archaic and bears striking resemblance to many much older traditions. With regards to these older traditions, Michael E. Stone, in his book Ancient Judaism, talks about how the astronomical book and the early material of the Book of Watches refers to this older literature dubbed the Book of Noah. And this is something that Milik, who is the sort of defining scholar in the early translation of the Qumran fragments of Enoch, really put forward this view. And while there's no archaeological evidence to be found to prove the existence of the Book of Noah, which would certainly date back to the pre-flood era itself, there is textual similarities between elements in 1st Enoch and Jubilees, which suggest quotations from these earlier works called the Words of Enoch and Noah, or the Book of Noah. This can be found in 1st Enoch 69 and 106, and also more so in the Book of Jubilees in chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 10, and chapter 21. Because of this, Stone has also identified evidence for such a text in other sectarian documents found at Qumran, and these include the Book of Aramaic Levi, the Genesis Apocryphon, and such. And if you want to learn more about this literature, this understanding of the Book of Noah itself, Michael E. Stone has actually written an entire journal article discussing this, which is called The Books Attributed to Noah, and he goes into more detail and an extensive catalogue of all of the different texts that were influenced by this ancient manuscript tradition. But the basic takeaway here is just to suggest that there are sections in Enochic literature that certainly are very, very old. And while the text itself is understood to be exilic in its production and definitely came about in the Second Temple period in its present form, it's important to note that there are actually sections of the text that could go all the way back to the patriarchal figure Enoch himself. And this was certainly the view of J.T. Milik, who I just mentioned earlier, but J.T. Milik was the sort of the leading scholar in the translation of the early Enoch material, which was found at Qumran. And he actually put forward the notion that the five-fold structure of the Enochic corpus, which we'll look at in a second, he actually viewed this as demonstrating a deliberate design, almost as another Pentateuch, a rival to the Mosaic Pentateuch, which he called the Enochic Pentateuch. For him, this served as a rival Torah, one which actually traced its lineage and authority further back than Moses to Enoch and to Noah and to Adam himself. And in this, it was Enoch who was the source of the true revelation, not Moses. And this was sort of driven by the implied antiquity, which we just talked about, of sections like the Book of Watches and the Astronomical Book, and also their relation to the patriarch who walked with God and was taken, being Enoch in Genesis 5. And this sort of all worked together to cement their role as the original revelation of Yahweh. And Milik even went as far to say that the Enochic material predated the Mosaic priestly material of Genesis 4 to 8. And Boccaccini summarizes it this way. He says, Milik was convinced then that the relationship between Genesis and the Book of Watches, which is the earliest stratum of the Book of Enoch, had to be reversed. He said, far from being an expansion of the biblical text, the Enochic version of the myth of the fallen angels, for Milik at least, was the original source and predated the composition of the Yahwist text, the text in Genesis 1 to 11. This then made the Genesis passage, Genesis 6, 1-4, a shortened form of the broader and much older Enochic text. And it's worth noting that modern scholars, or indeed very famous biblical scholars, have at times actually agreed with Milik here. Margaret Barker, who we read from just briefly before, says that the Genesis account of the fallen angels has been heavily edited, and this is mainly due to the fact that the text is only 4 verses long and seems to be hinting at a much older tradition the original audience were aware of that we as modern readers don't have access to. She says that this is the Enoch tradition. It preserves the original form of the account in First Enoch and preserves ancient ideas that were eventually dropped from the Old Testament. And Gerhard von Rad, a very famous and well-known Old Testament commentator who wrote the very famous Old Testament theology, volumes 1 and 2. In his commentary on Genesis, he says the material, referring to Genesis 5 and the understanding of Enoch, gives the impression of being only a brief reference to a much more extensive tradition. It is an open question, therefore, whether much of the apocalyptic Enoch tradition is not really very old and precedes in time the biblical narratives. And this is really quite a bold claim to even suggest that literature that is no longer or not in the Bible was actually older than the Bible and actually informs it and actually precedes it. It's a very bold claim. That's predominantly to do with the Book of Watchers and the myth of the fallen angels, but James Vanderkam has also noted the age of the astronomical book points to the author of First Enoch as having a very old form of writing in mind when he writes the Enochic law. He says, by presenting the seventh biblical patriarch as the person to whom God chose to reveal this specific astronomical information, the writer ranks Enoch alongside much older culture heroes from the older and more ancient societies of the world. He says that there was a widespread belief in the ancient Near East and in the classical world that knowledge about the sun, moon, and stars was divulged to special individuals at the dawn of history. And in this literature, Enoch is set among their ranks, making the revelation to Enoch very, very old, and of course predating the revelation to Moses on Mount Sinai. With all that being said, though, it is important to clarify that the current form of the text that we have today is certainly to be dated to around 400 BC, so around the late Exilic age. And this is mainly because of the words used in the text and the themes in the text, but also the way that these themes connect with many doctrinal controversies of this period, which sort of help to give it its Sitz im Leben, or its situation in life. And these themes are ideas of impurity, especially with the priesthood. And this connects with the Enochic adversity towards the current post-exilic priesthood of the Zadokites. There's also the controversy of the liturgical calendar, which was a very big deal in the Second Temple period and actually led to certain groups of Second Temple Judaism splitting off. One of the most famous was the Essenes, who believed that the temple liturgical system in Jerusalem was corrupt, and so they moved into the desert around the Dead Sea at Qumran to start their own liturgical and priestly community. Themes also of the return of Israel and the identity of the elect and the righteous is rife throughout the Enochic corpus. And this was really a big concept in the Second Temple period, trying to figure out who represented the true Israel after the judgment of the exile. And then, of course, we see the exilic period is really the birth of the eschatological literature and the apocalyptic literature. It moves from the prophetic into the eschatological, and this is stuff that we see in the book of Daniel, but it continued all the way through the Second Temple period. And the book of Enoch is really no stranger to this theme. In fact, the whole of Enoch really serves as an apocalyptic revelation to the patriarch himself. And these controversies really spurred the authors of the present Enochic collection to view their work in this way as that alternative Pentateuch. So while the text is clearly an exilic work, these themes and the idea that Enoch may have had this revelation as an alternative to the Mosaic was one that was still championed in the Enochic communities. They viewed this literature as the new revelation or the true revelation, and also one that could rival the Jerusalem liturgical functions. So Enoch then is almost a salvific figure in the Enochic tradition, and he's sort of what Milik would call the antediluvian sage par excellence, the original prophet of God. We note that Jubilees 4:24 and 1 Enoch 12 say that Enoch was taken without knowing, no one knew where, and he was with the angels. And this idea of Enoch being removed from the cosmic disorder that's created through the angels' sin and affected all of God's creation sort of meant that Enoch had a very specific and special place in God's salvation because he was apart from the sin that had affected all humanity. And so scholars suggest that unlike his successor Moses, Enoch had lived before the angelic sin and never died but was taken by God. And now that he was in heaven, he had direct access to God's revelation. Likewise, his priestly function is a heavenly one, and he can be said to be the source of the true priesthood and the true revelation that one day would manifest on the earth as God's vehicle for salvation. And this is one that we even see in the biblical text in the Psalms. And so from this we can see that the Enochians didn't simply attribute the status of divine revelation to the books of Enoch, but also the true priesthood to the works of Enoch. Enoch constituted this antediluvian ministry that had been lost to the world during the flood, but was now being given back to the world through the Enochic traditions and the Enochic communities. And so this was sort of hearkening back to a pre-fall priesthood, which was given to Adam in the garden and then passed on to Enoch and then passed on to Noah. We see that Enoch is the one who could read the heavenly tablets and understand everything. And this is a real callback to Adam, who understood the names of all creation and had this very specific role before God as his vice-regent on creation. Boccaccini sums it this way: he says, "The heavenly dwelling and the familial ties made Enoch the perfect forerunner of a tradition that claimed to have survived the flood and reached the present of Israel. The antiquity of Enoch was also made him the perfect vehicle for a revelation that claimed to be over and above that of Moses." For the Enochians, then, not only did Enoch's supposed tradition have its iniquity to bolster its authenticity, but unlike his rival Moses, he had lived before the angelic sin and never died, but was taken by God. And now that he was in heaven, he had direct access to God's revelation. And this is really what sets Enoch as the center figure of the Enochic tradition, why the group of Enochic Judaism was centered around him as sort of the patriarch of this group, and why he sort of functioned in this Second Temple milieu as a rival to Moses, or as a fulfillment or the true form of the revelation that Moses had brought. Turning from that, then, we look at how the Enochic traditions were applied in the Second Temple period. And we really only have the survival of the community at Qumran to show us maybe what a Enochic Jewish community may have looked like. Josephus says that the Essenes took great pains in studying the writings of the ancients and chose out of them what was most for the advantage of their soul and body. He also says that they inquire after roots and medicinal stones so that they may cure their ills. They also, among them, undertook to foretell things that come by the reading of the holy books and of the discourses of the prophets. So for Josephus, there was a real sort of Enochic centrality towards the Essenes. We see that the idea of them reading the works of the ancients, foretelling things that were to come by reading the holy books and the prophets, and also even their idea of looking at roots and medicinal stones are all Enochic things. David Jackson highlights this. He says that the Essenes apply themselves to the works of the ancients seems a reference to pre-sectarian literature. Pre-sectarian meaning literature that predated the Enochic sect, the Enochic group. So these older traditions that we'd identified before. And this would seem to include elements of First Enoch and Jubilees. And then he notes on, with regard to the list of medicinal and herbal roots that the Essenes looked at, that this is a list of subjects which correlate directly with matters revealed by the fallen angels in 1 Enoch 7. He says that this is knowledge of healing which Noah had also received as a counter-revelation from the angel Raphael in the book of Jubilees. And so for the Enochic community, the Enochic tradition, the work of First Enoch, the work of Jubilees, was really a central paradigm for their entire community. And so from this, we can see that the Qumran community, the Essenes, were really a remnant of a Enochic community. George Nicholsberg agrees with this. He says Qumran provides an identifiable location in ancient Judaism for the substantial use and influence of the Enochic traditions. He says the evidence is diverse. The influence of the Enochic traditions at Qumran is evidence in the community's possession of multiple copies of the texts, which either employed or quoted from books like Jubilees and Enoch. We see in books like the Genesis Apocryphon or the Pesha on the story of the Watchers, or even their translation of the book of Genesis, many of which copied from the Enochic text. He also said that the site yielded 11 manuscripts of First Enoch, which dated back to the 2nd century BC, some of the oldest manuscripts that we have. So he concludes then that the Enochic traditions were alive and well at Qumran. He also says that the proliferation of the material at Qumran suggests that the community attracted people who prized the Enochic texts and others closely, or at least provided a place for the copying and use of these texts and the incorporation of their traditions, hence an Enochic Jewish community. Even the understanding of Enochic theology formed a central part of the theology of the community at Qumran, especially when it came to their liturgical practices. He says the Enochic calendrical system was fundamental to the Qumran community, while their eschatological views were informed by the eschatological consciousness of First Enoch. He concludes that the story of the Watchers informed their views of the pollution of the Jerusalem cult and also the imminence of the Messiah. And so we can say in conclusion that the Qumran community itself was probably the closest that we can get to understanding how the Enochic tradition was developed and also how the Enochic tradition was implemented within the Second Temple Jewish milieu. And that's where we'll leave this first session. We've looked at the themes of Enochic theology, the community that it belonged to, the tradition itself, and a little bit of the history of the literature, and then finally looked at the application of this literature within a Jewish community. So hopefully this first session has served as a good introduction to the literature of First Enoch, and we'll leave it here, and in the next section we'll look at the book of First Enoch itself. Thanks for watching.